We are continuing our interview series on the margins of the Black Sea and Balkan Security Forum, one of the most relevant debating platforms for defense and security matters. Today, here with me, I have General David Petraeus, one of the most important recent US military leaders with over 37 years experience in the military field. General Petraeus, without further ado, I would like to jump straight into the first question. How do you evaluate NATO's current role in European security, particularly in the face of renewed Russian aggression? What steps should NATO take to increase its deterrence posture on the eastern flank?
Well, first of all, great to be with you, Serge. Clearly, NATO is far and away the most important security organization in Europe, perhaps in the world. It is an extraordinary alliance. It prevailed, of course, in the Cold War. I had assignments in NATO stretching from when I was a second lieutenant, part of the Allied Command Europe Mobile Force and an airborne battalion in Italy, through service in the Cold War and the inter-German border, speechwriter for the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, and then ultimately 1, 3, and 4-star assignments with NATO as well in Bosnia, Iraq, and Afghanistan. It's an extraordinary organization, but as with any organization, you have to constantly evolve as the situation, the context evolves, and the situation has evolved here. Vladimir Putin has done more than anyone else in the world to make NATO great again, or at least more relevant again. He prompted his brutal, unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, denying its very right to exist, led two historically neutral powers, Finland and Sweden, of course, to join NATO on an expedited basis. They are now part of NATO and make Russia's job even tougher, extending the border with NATO very considerable additional distances. There is a new strategic concept for NATO forces and so forth that was put forward by the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe last year and approved. The job now, frankly, is to operationalize that, to take that overarching strategic context, which of course, needless to say, focuses much more on Eastern Europe and pushing forces and capabilities and deterrence out to the east, especially to those countries that share borders with Russia, or in the case of Romania, share borders with Ukraine and Moldova, which Moldova, of course, if Putin was ever to succeed in Ukraine, would be the next target. So that process is now ongoing. There's a process of force generation that's part of it. It's a process of designing the organizational architecture that will be used, again, to operationalize the big ideas at the level of the Supreme Allied Commander Europe. We need to accelerate that process. Also, frankly, need to increase not just spending on defense in European countries, not just all of them getting to 2% of GDP, but also increasing the military industrial capacity of European countries. We've seen the enormous expenditure of certain munitions in Ukraine, and the fact is that all NATO countries, the United States included, need to ramp up production of artillery shells, certain weapon systems, and so forth. And that is all ongoing, but we need to accelerate that process.
Well, thank you. And when talking about the eastern flank, of course, the U.S. plays a pivotal role in that, and which will only increase with the recent adoption of the U.S. Black Sea strategy last year. What are the critical elements of the strategy moving forward?
Well, a big element was to actually put a U.S. headquarters back, a 3-star headquarters back in European soil. Of course, it's in eastern Poland, but then it has forces in the Baltics and in other locations as well. There's got to be the incorporation to the far north of Finland and Sweden into the overarching NATO structure and architecture. And then when it comes here, we're talking about a mix of different systems that are being added, whether they're air and ballistic missile defense, early warning and systems, naval systems, and so forth. Noting that we should learn from what Ukraine has done to the Russian Black Sea Fleet, i.e. sunk 1/3 of it, and it has done so with a mix of air and maritime drones and anti-ship missiles, perhaps supported by intelligence that might be shared by other countries as well, when you think about the capabilities of some of the NATO members, including perhaps my own country. So that, I think, is an example to us that we need to recognize how vulnerable ships can be at sea, in a world where you can see everything from the surface on up, which means that therefore we shouldn't forget submarine and submarine capabilities and also detection of submarines. But the fact is that the Russians have had to withdraw the Black Sea fleet, for the most part, from the western Black Sea, which has enabled Ukraine, once again, to export grain by ship, which is hugely important. They're 25% of the world's grain exports. And Egypt and other North African countries depend very much on for food security on what they can get from Ukraine. It's also very important to the Ukrainian fiscal situation to be able to sell this grain at world prices.
Of course. All right then. Well, thank you so much for your insightful answers. And before you conclude, I was wondering if you could share some thoughts on the 8th edition of the Black Sea and Balkan Security Forum with us.
Well, the fact that I'm here indicates that I think it's quite worthwhile. I've been here before. It's great to return now that the pandemic is in the rearview mirror, we hope. And again, really an extraordinary group of speakers, attendees, activities, subjects, topics, and so forth. Everything from Nobel laureates to, again, current and former commanders, intelligence officers, business leaders. Really an extraordinary gathering, a great forum, and beautiful weather for it this year as well.
Okay, and thanks so much for your time and the kind words.